Okay, Einat will start. Okay, so I'd like to start by, and I want to talk about Avigil and Yitzhak Shamir. I want to talk about the story described earlier, and I wanted to mention that what was interesting to me is that, in fact, both Yitzhak Shamir and Avigil had a similar perception of morality. Both of them talked about solidarity and rescuing Jews as their main purpose, main objectives, and they discussed what will serve it better, but none of them actually had a different perception. None of them said, okay, how come we have PLO's prisoners? That could have been a legitimate perception. How come the state of Israel imprisons Palestinians prisoners? So I think that this was not Avigil's approach. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a cadet in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But that's also a kind of perception. And in fact, both Avigil and Yitzhak Shamir had the same perception, but there was a difference about what will serve it better. So, in the same way, as I know Gezehava, I think that we both have the same similar perception of morality. Both of us want peace. This is something we all have in common. I think that if nothing have changed, we're both interested in a Jewish state, and we both of us want Palestinians to actually live their lives separately from us, even if they can't do it the best way. But both of us think that the correct thing to do is that the two nations, Palestinians and Jews, will be able to control their own destiny and will be under two political units, regimes. As far as I know, none of us has this perception, a different perception. None of us believes that Zionism is an immoral concept, or that the concept of Jewish solidarity is immoral. So it's important to understand that even if we talk and if we do argue, it's all about the related to understandings, and other people. They actually, on the other side, although some of these people will claim that their perception is even more moral or as moral as ours. So it's not a moral question here. It's a matter of analysis. What differentiates between Zehava and myself is the level, what we see as the level of responsibility of Israel, and what should Israel do more when it comes to the Palestinian arena. Once I understood that it's becoming the line that differentiates between left and right, when the book, The Fight Over Law of Return, was published. So I talked a lot about it in Israel. And then at the end of one of the lectures, one woman approached me and she said, you always say you are a leftist, but you don't speak like a leftist. So what makes you a leftist? So I said, because at the end I believe that there are two peoples here. It doesn't matter what they believe about themselves. They both agree that they're not like the other. And I think that the correct thing to do is that they share this territory, and each of them will control its own fate. That's what makes me a leftist. So she said, okay, but I also believe in that, and I'm from the Likud party. So it made me realize that more and more what differentiates between us is the question who has the responsibility, who bears the responsibility, and who is at fault, and who should do something about the situation. And indeed, I hear this is the difference between us. I don't think it's a matter of morality. I think that it's a matter of analysis of the problem and the things that should be done. So my perception is that when it comes to any objective aspect, from the beginning, Zionism has done more than enough. starting with one of the things that I really like to show is that we purchased the land, malaria land. It's a fascinating example. So there was actually comparison between the map of malaria in Israel and the map of the partition. It's amazing to look at it. So which lands did we purchase and dried out? So, and which lands did we agreed on when they talked about the partition plan? Also, there was this matter of closing the gates. With all due respect to the Swiss, I don't expect them to do that. I don't think that we don't emphasize the responsibility of the Arabs and the British when it comes to closing the gates. It wasn't the Swiss responsibility to accept us. There was a state here in de facto, and if it weren't for the anti-Zionism, we would have had a state earlier. And I think that nobody emphasizes the Arabs' responsibility to the fact that the gates were closed. And also, it has to do with the acceptance of partition plan and war of independence, and Israel again and again was willing to negotiate as a victor state and to take a step back. And I think that there was no similar case in history, and Israel has done it again and again. And they actually made some proposals. We were willing to end the conflict. And in this sense, I think and I believe that the mandate and accepting the partition plan, Zionism is almost unique in its willingness to meet these high standards. And let me say it even in an extreme way, the most essential problem when we talk about as an essential problem with Zionism is Arab anti-Zionism. If we ignore it for a minute, then I don't think that Zionism in itself has any moral problem embedded in it. We meet very high standards. I don't think that that there is no other state meets such high standards, and we've done it from day one. So the basic of conflict is one. Many people claim that the conflict is complicated. Maybe there are many details, but in essence, it's very simple. It's a conflict between Zionism and anti-Zionism. So Bevin said the Jews want a state and the Arabs do not want the Jews to have a state. That's the essence of the conflict. And if that's the essence of the conflict, then we have to ask the question, what Israel could have done if that's the essence? If we actually, who are we dealing with? We're dealing with people who at every given moment they can get a state on part of the territory, but they refuse to accept it. And here we are facing a problem. It's as if it's a moral problem, but actually it's the gap between those who want to feel good and those who want to do good. When it comes to this conflict, doing good requires not to feel good. What does it mean? It means that in order to end this conflict, the conflict ends in two possible ways. Either Jewish Zionism loses or anti-Zionism loses. It cannot be any other solution. We will just continue with this war of attrition together because I don't want Zionism, Jewish Zionism to stop. What we need to do is to cause anti-Zionism to stop. What does it mean? Not to give it legitimacy to this Arab-Palestinian notion that Israel is weak, is about to extinct, it's on its way out, and it's similar to the Crusades or the French in Algeria or the Americans in Afghanistan. So it means that we need to make it very clear to the Palestinians that the war of 48 has ended and that they are not refugees. Whoever lives in Gaza, whoever lives in Jordan or in Ramallah, they are not refugees. They need to understand that The War of 48 was supposed to prevent the partition, and they lost this war. And like any other nation, they need to move on. They can develop a perception, constructive perception, building a Palestinian Arab state alongside Israel. But they need to understand that as long as they don't change their position, they won't have friends, they won't have any support. It's unpleasant to say these things. It doesn't feel good to say it. What feels good is to help and to say that they are poor and miserable, and we need to do that, and we are the stronger ones. But essentially, the responsibility they're responsible to end this notion of anti-Zionism and to build a state alongside Israel, and to quit this notion of having a state of their own across this territory. And that's what we need to do. The Palestinians should separate from this anti-Zionism approach. That's the only way to end this conflict. And it means that we won't necessarily feel good, but that will make us do good. So that's a kind of a moral perception, even if it doesn't sound good. Now I'd like to say one more thing about the poll, the survey. I took something else, a different takeaway. Ben Gurion, as you know, talked about what we need to do. We need to be just, we need to be strong. Being just is not objective, is whether it has to do with a feeling that we are just. Internally, it's quite impressive. Majority of people in Israel continues to feel that the Zionism and IDF are moral. So in this term, I think that the Israeli public proves that it's healthy and has common sense. And when it comes to the external world, we need to expand the circle beyond the question of what I call the apartheid community. Yes, they don't think that we are moral, but I don't think that we have to say we need to understand that this apartheid committee is just a secular resurrection of a certain wing of Christianity, and they want to improve the Jews. And so the idea of human rights is secularization process, and this is how they see Israel, and this is how they see collective Jews. So I really doubt whether we have to listen to it. We need to decide whether it's effective for us to listen to them. But I think that, and that would be my final statement, because there is an emerging perception that is immoral. It's popular among certain groups of Judaism, young Jews, both in Israel and overseas. And it's a perception, moral perception, that a colleague of mine calls, it's a moral perception of lack of power. A colleague of mine called the last time the Jews were really moral was on the queue to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. So this is the idea, lack of power. I think it's anti-Jewish perception. You cannot be a moral person if you don't face such dilemmas. If you don't have any power, then you're doomed. So that's why I understand that this idea is very attractive, morality, lack of power, but I don't find it interesting, because I think that deeply there is something very immoral and non-Jewish about it, in this notion of lack of power as a moral thing.